At 7:30 a.m. on December 21st, 1944, crouched low against a half-collapsed factory wall in Malmedy, PFC Francis S. Currey felt the cold bite through his jacket. Breath fogged in the gray dawn, his glove warmed the stiff trigger of an M1 Garand he'd kept because it shoots straight. A distant metallic whisper rolled up the road, a shadowed line of tracks, a glint where tank steel met winter sun, a movement that didn't belong in the quiet. He was small in the frame of things, 19, the quiet one, the kid they called Barn Rifle Boy. Older sergeants doubted him. Guys joked his rifle belonged in a barn. No kidding. He wasn't supposed to be the answer to anything. He carried a weapon people mocked, a handful of grenades, and nothing more than grit and stubbornness. But someone had to move. Someone had to reach 5 men stuck out in the open, pinned by MGs and armor. How do you stop an armored thrust with a rusty Garand and a kid who'd never fired a bazooka? Something slid just beyond the tree line, and Currey rose. The night before the attack, the factory yard was quiet enough that Currey could hear the ice shifting on the roof. Men huddled around small, dying fires, rubbing their hands, swapping rumors about German armor pushing through the Ardennes. Currey sat a little apart, cleaning that same battered M1, the rifle everyone teased him about. Its wooden stock was worn smooth, scratched from mud, barns, field marches, and one too many forced retreats. "Kid," the squad clown muttered, nudging him with an elbow, "that rifle of yours looks like it's older than you." Currey didn't rise to it, didn't get flustered, didn't even look up. He just said, quietly, "Shoot straight. That's all I need." The older sergeants watched him from the next bench, trading comments they didn't bother to hide. "Soft-hearted kid. Barely talks. Nice enough, but leadership material? Not a chance." Currey heard every word. He just kept running an oiled rag along a bolt that had seen more winters than he had years. A gust of wind cut through the broken windows, scattering ash. Snow drifted in like pale dust. Currey shifted, pulling his coat tighter, checking the rifle again and again. He had a feeling he couldn't name, a quiet thrum beneath the cold, like the world was holding its breath. Sometime after midnight, when the fires went out, he tested the trigger. It stuck, frozen stiff. So he cupped the rifle close, breathed warm air over the metal, felt the cold sting jump from his lips to his fingertips. Slowly, the trigger eased. One more small victory no one would ever notice. Currey lay back on his pack, staring through a hole in the ceiling at a sky broken by smoke and winter clouds. He thought about home, about how he never looked like the tough guys, about how nobody expected him to do anything remarkable. He wasn't angry. That wasn't his way. He just felt a steady resolve rising inside him, the kind that doesn't make noise but refuses to move. Somewhere out beyond the tree line, a single engine rumbled, then cut short, too distant to be certain, too familiar to ignore. Currey sat up, gripping his rifle, listening to the wind and the silence that followed. A silence that felt wrong, tight, waiting. Morning wasn't far away, and something out there was already moving. At 06:45, the first thin, blue strip of dawn pushed through the Ardennes clouds. Currey was already awake, boots laced, breath fogging in the icy air as he stepped into the courtyard. The factory grounds were silent. Too silent. The kind that makes a soldier scan every rooftop twice. Snow drifted in lazy spirals, landing on crates, on spent brass, frozen into the mud, on the shoulders of men who hadn't slept enough to dream. Then, almost gently, the world cracked open. A low rumble rolled through the valley, deep, steady, mechanical, not thunder, not friendly. Armor. Currey froze and listened. Tracks, multiple sets, moving fast. Shouts snapped through the yard. Men scrambled, grabbing rifles, helmets, belts, anything not frozen to the ground. Someone yelled, "They're here!" "They're coming straight through the line!" But the line had already buckled. Currey could hear it in the rising panic, in the scatter of boots, in the sudden burst of machine gun fire from somewhere far too close. By 07:20, German infantry poured through the tree line, shadows moving tight and practiced, pushing smoke in front of them as a screen. Currey ducked behind a stack of splintered pallets, Garand tight against his chest. Wind sliced through the gaps in the ruined walls. The cold stung his knuckles until he could barely feel them. He peeked around the edge. German MG teams were already setting up near the road, covering the advance. Panzer tracks churned the snow beyond them, grinding the earth into a slurry of mud and ice. Currey caught a glimpse of a commander pointing toward their position, toward the factory, marking it as a target. This wasn't a probe. This was a winter hammer meant to break them clean in half. A burst of MG-42 fire tore across the courtyard, stitching holes through crates and stone. Currey ducked, heart pounding, but face calm, a strange steadiness washing over him. He aimed a quick glance to his right, where a few of his buddies tried to return fire, only to be forced back by the sheer volume of rounds snapping past their ears. At 0730, the order hit like a slap. "Fall back! All squads! Fall back to the factory!" Currey didn't argue, didn't hesitate. He ran. Boots hammered frozen ground. Ice shattered underfoot. Bullets hunted the air above his head. Inside the factory's broken shell, a handful of Americans pressed against walls, breath sharp, eyes wide. Someone slammed the door shut, though it had no hinges left. Then came the realization, a brutal one that settled like a stone in every man's gut. 5 Americans were still outside, pinned flat in the open by MG fire, no cover, no chance of reaching them. Currey saw them through a shattered window, 5 dark shapes hugging the ground, snow piling over their sleeves as German tracers cut the space around them. A tank angled toward their position, turret swinging slow and deliberate. One of the trapped men lifted a hand, a small gesture, helpless, desperate. Currey swallowed hard. No way they survived the next few minutes. No way anyone could reach them. But he kept staring, kept tracking every enemy movement, every flicker of opportunity, because something inside him was shifting, settling, tightening. Something that told him the day wasn't finished shaping him yet. And something outside, just beyond the smoke, was starting to move again. The factory interior smelled of old oil, cold brick, and fear that men tried hard not to show. Currey stood near a gap in the wall, his breath rising in pale bursts as he watched the 5 Americans pinned outside. Snow drifted across their uniforms. German tracers carved bright lines over their heads. The tank turret crawled toward them like some patient predator. One sergeant inside muttered, "They're done. Nobody can reach them now." Another whispered, "Kid, don't even think about it." Currey didn't answer. He just kept watching, noting angles, distances, timing, the way a hunter studies a field before he steps into it. The wind shoved cold air through the broken windows, rattling loose sheet metal. Every man inside flinched at the sound. The MG-42s outside were cycling fast, their rhythm sharp and merciless. There was no break, no lull, no mercy in that steel song. Currey's hands tightened around his Garand. The stock felt familiar, almost warm despite the frost. This was the rifle guys mocked, the one with the scratched up wood and barnyard stains. But to Currey, it was steady, reliable, a strange comfort when everything else felt like it was falling apart. At 0745, the tank's coaxial MG began sweeping the snowfield, stitching arcs closer and closer to the trapped Americans. One of them tried to crawl. A sharp burst pinned him flat again. Currey's jaw tightened. He didn't look heroic, didn't look angry, just determined, a quiet fire behind steady eyes. Then he whispered something under his breath. Not loud, not dramatic, just a promise to himself. "I'll bring them home." No one heard it clearly. But something in his posture changed. A slight forward lean, a settling of shoulders, the calm before a decision most men wouldn't consider. The factory shook as another tank round slammed into the outer wall, showering the room with dust. Men ducked, cursed, grabbed their helmets tighter. Currey stayed upright, eyes fixed on the battlefield through a jagged window frame. Outside, German infantry were shifting, moving in teams, creeping closer to the 5 pinned Americans. They meant to finish the job up close. Currey's heartbeat slowed. His breathing steadied. The world narrowed to shapes and shadows, to distances he could cover, to targets he could break apart one by one. He ran a thumb along the Garand's cold metal, tested the action, checked the bandolier at his side. He wasn't supposed to be this guy. He wasn't supposed to be the one who charged into machine gun fire. He wasn't supposed to be the soldier men trusted to change the outcome. But the quiet kid nobody believed in was about to step out into a winter hell, because someone had to. Outside, a German squad leader raised his hand, signaling the push toward the pinned Americans. And Currey moved a half step forward, ready to do something impossible, just as another shape flickered in the smoke. At 0800, Currey exhaled once, slow and steady, then slipped through the shattered doorway before anyone could grab his sleeve. Cold air slammed into his face. Snow hissed under his boots. The open courtyard stretched ahead, flat, exposed, deadly. German MGs snapped instantly toward him. He dropped to one knee behind a half-frozen crate, the wood exploding under the first burst. Chips sliced past his cheek. Steam rose from the fresh bullet holes like breath from a wounded animal. Currey didn't flinch. He should have been pinned. He should have been shredded. But he saw a rhythm, the slight pause when the MG-42 barrels overheated and teams shifted their aim. A tiny window, barely a second. He rose into it. The Garand barked once. A German rifleman crumpled. Second shot. MG assistant dropped, hands flying open. Third shot. Another soldier folded into the snow, his weapon clattering against a fuel drum. 3 rounds. 3 threats gone. And for a heartbeat, the German line hesitated. No kidding. Even they weren't ready for a lone kid charging them with a beat-up rifle. Currey slid behind a stone pillar as the next wave of fire raked the courtyard. Dust and brick rained down over his helmet. He tasted grit. He kept moving. Inside the factory, someone shouted, "He's crazy! Get back, kid!" But Currey tuned them out. The 5 pinned Americans were still flat in the snow, barely 20 yards ahead, barely alive. If he stopped now, they were done. He leaned out again, sighting down the Garand's iron notch. He wasn't shaking. He wasn't breathing fast. He was calm, focused the way a man gets when the world narrows to a single purpose. He fired again. This time not to kill, but to force German MG teams to pull back their aim, to buy inches of movement. A tracer hissed inches from his helmet. Currey ducked low, slid behind another crate, then sprinted 5 yards farther into the open, boots slipping on frost. He hit the ground hard, rolled behind a broken cart, and checked the field again. Every move cost him seconds he didn't have. Each second felt like a lifetime for the 5 men bleeding into the snow. He wiped ice from his sights, checked angles, counted silhouettes through drifting smoke. He needed more firepower. He needed a way to punch back harder. He needed something. Then, as the wind shifted, he spotted a dark shape sprawled near a collapsed wall, a fallen American. And beside the body, half buried in snow, was a Browning automatic rifle. Currey's breath caught. That was the punch he needed. But reaching it meant crossing 30 open yards with MGs already hunting him. He tightened his grip on the Garand, shoulders settling, eyes narrowing. 30 yards. Heavy fire. No cover. But if he didn't reach that bar, the 5 trapped men were finished, and so was he. Currey braced his boots. And somewhere beyond the smoke, a German shouted an order just as Currey prepared to push into the open again. At 0808, Currey planted his boots in the snow, stared at that BAR lying beside the fallen GI, and made his choice. 30 meters of dead open ground. MGs locked on his last position. German infantry shifting to cut him off. Didn't matter. He rose from behind the broken cart and sprinted. The cold slapped his face. The world turned into sharp breaths and white explosions of snow beneath each stride. Bullets tore past his ears, snapping the air so close he felt the heat of their passage. Brick shards detonated behind him with every step, peppering his back like burning sand. He didn't slow. Garand in one hand, grenade bandolier slapping against his chest, eyes fixed on that single patch of ground ahead. Halfway across, a round clipped the heel of his boot, spinning him sideways. He stumbled, caught himself, pushed harder. Another burst hit so close the snow beside him leapt into a white fountain. Inside the factory, one of the Americans muttered, "That kid's dead. Nobody lives through that." But Currey wasn't listening. He was counting seconds, counting gaps, counting breaths, the way only a calm mind does under fire. 10 meters to go. German MGs recalibrated, barrels swinging toward his chest. Too slow. He was already throwing himself forward, sliding the last few feet on his hip through slush and broken ice. His glove closed around cold steel. The bar. Currey yanked it free from the snow, rolled behind the fallen soldier's body, and hugged the weapon tight. The weight was different, heavier, promising real punch. Snowflakes caught on the cooling fins. The trigger felt clumsy in his stiff gloves. He slung the Garand over his shoulder without ceremony. This wasn't about pride. This was survival. Currey crawled a few feet to a chunk of collapsed masonry, bracing the bar on the rough stone. He scanned the battlefield, MG teams shifting, infantry stacking behind a burning cart, a tank edging forward with slow confidence, turret turning like a hunting head. His breath steadied again. One deep pull of frozen air, One exhale. He squeezed the trigger. The bar roared to life. Rounds hammered into the German assault group, shredding snow, splintering crates, knocking men backward into drifts. The sudden violence of it shocked the line. No kidding. They weren't expecting a lone American kid to hit back with a full auto beast. German soldiers dove for cover. One stumbled, dropped his rifle, crawled desperately behind a wheel well. A second tried to sprint left and vanished behind a curtain of bar fire. Currey shifted slightly, tracking the movement of another squad edging wide. He fired a long burst, forcing them flat. He could feel the weapon heating, vibrating through his gloves, the recoil jumping into his shoulder. He wasn't angry, wasn't shouting, wasn't reckless. He was precise, every burst measured, every movement deliberate. But even as he drove the Germans back, something new was happening. A tank was peeling off from the main line, angling toward him, turret low, its coaxial MG twitching like a finger on a trigger. Currey saw it, saw the angle, saw the problem. The bar wouldn't stop that beast. He wiped snow from his brow, scanning for options. And that's when he spotted a long tube lying beside a wrecked Jeep. A weapon he'd never fired, never trained on, barely understood. A bazooka. The kind of thing that could change everything, if he could reach it before the tank found him. At 08:15, Currey eased the hot bar to the snow, steam drifting from the barrel like breath from a tired horse. The German infantry had pulled back for the moment, shaken, confused, convinced a full American fire team was hammering them. But the tank creeping toward him, that was different. Its tracks chewed through the frozen courtyard with slow, deliberate weight. Its coaxial MG blinked with small, probing bursts, feeling for him, searching like fingertips in the dark. Currey wiped frost from his eyelashes and scanned the debris field again. There, by the wrecked Jeep, the long, narrow tube with a cracked shoulder sling. A bazooka! He swallowed once. He had never fired one, never loaded one, never even been near one long enough to ask how it worked. But a tank didn't care about his resume. And the 5 pinned Americans still lay out there in the biting wind, faces buried in the snow, waiting for someone to do something impossible. Currey slid low, hugging the ground. His elbows dragged through icy slush, his uniform soaked through instantly. He shifted between broken bricks, timing each move with the tank's rumbling advance. 6 feet. Stop. 4 feet. Slide. 2 feet. Breathe. The bazooka was 10 yards away. Might as well have been a mile. He took a slow breath, feeling the cold burn his lungs. He remembered the sergeants calling him soft-hearted. Remembered the jokes about his barnstock rifle. Remembered the quiet sting of not being taken seriously. He wasn't trying to prove anything. He was just trying to save 5 men. Currey rose to a crouch and sprinted. A shell slammed into the wall behind him, showering his back with dust. The coaxial MG spat a burst that walked across the snow, chasing him with frightening precision. Currey dove behind the Jeep, skinning his shoulder on rusted metal. The bazooka lay beside a spent tire, half covered in frozen mud. He grabbed it. Cold metal stung his palms through the gloves. The weight felt awkward, unfamiliar, like carrying someone else's burden. Currey muttered under his breath, "Guess we're learning this now." He checked the rear of the tube. Empty. He scanned the ground, heartbeat drumming in his ears. There, a single rocket lying beside the Jeep, the fins dusted with frost. Currey pulled it close, feeling the clumsy shape, the greasy cold. He'd watched someone load one once, months ago. Maybe. Memory was a fog in moments like this. He slid the rocket into the tube. It stuck. He twisted, nudged, pressed harder. It clicked into place. He didn't even know if the thing was armed. The tank lurched closer, engine growling, turret swinging toward the Jeep. Currey braced the tube across his shoulder, boots planted in slush, heart steady. This wasn't bravery. This was necessity. And as he slowly peeked around the smoking Jeep frame, he saw the tank's gun shift, locking directly onto his position. Currey exhaled. He didn't have seconds left. He had one. Currey steadied the bazooka on his shoulder, feeling the weight drag him slightly off balance. The cold metal bit through his coat. Snow swirled in thin, nervous spirals around his boots. The tank halted 30 yards away, turret squared with lethal certainty, coaxial MG already twitching, ready to turn him into dust. Currey's breath fogged across the sight. He wiped it with a thumb. The world narrowed to one long tube, one clumsy rocket, and one decision no 19-year-old should have to make. A German commander popped up from the turret, shouting an order he didn't need to understand. The gesture alone told Currey everything. They saw him. They knew what he carried, and they weren't going to give him another second. Currey swallowed hard. He'd never fired one of these things, probably held it wrong, probably loaded it wrong, but the 5 Americans pinned out there didn't have time for him to figure it out the right way. He planted his feet deeper into the snow and whispered, "Come on, just work." The tank's MG snapped to life. Currey fired. The bazooka roared with a violent kick, smoke blasting out behind him, hot enough to melt the frost on the Jeep's fender. The rocket screamed across the short stretch of courtyard, a streak of fire slicing through drifting snow. It struck the tank's front plate with a flat metallic thud. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. No explosion, no fireball, just a dull echo hanging in the frozen air. Currey's stomach dropped. He thought he'd botched it. Loaded wrong, fired wrong, wasted the one chance he had. Then the tank shuddered. A thin crack of smoke leaked from the driver's viewport. The engine coughed, once, twice, like a dying animal. A second plume rose from the turret ring, darker this time, oily and rising fast. The commander vanished back into the tank. Another moment passed. Then the hatch flew open. A German crewman tumbled out, coughing, stumbling through the smoke. Another followed. Then a third. They weren't hit. They were bailing, abandoning their armored spearhead because a 19-year-old kid with a rusty Garand and a borrowed bazooka scared them out of it. Currey let out a slow breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. He dropped the empty tube, letting it clatter across the frozen ground. His shoulder throbbed from the recoil. His ears rang from the blast. But the field had changed. A tank was out of the fight. German infantry were shouting, scrambling, unsure how many Americans were hitting them. The pinned 5, still flat in the snow, lifted their heads for the first time in what felt like an eternity. Inside the factory, someone whispered, almost reverent, "Holy hell, it's the kid!" Currey didn't turn, didn't wave, didn't celebrate. He just picked up the bar again, snow clinging to the barrel, and scanned for the next threat, because the Germans weren't done, not by a long shot. And something in the tree line, a new shadow, a shifting squad, was moving into position, preparing for their next push. At 08:25, the battlefield changed again. Not quieter, not safer, just different. The tank lay silent, tracks half buried in churned snow, smoke curling from its vents. But German infantry were regrouping fast, shouting orders, shifting in tight formations. Currey could hear boots crunching through frost as they maneuvered around the dead tank, angling to box him in. He wiped the snow from his eyebrows and adjusted his grip on the bar. He could feel his pulse in the gloves, steady and cold, like a metronome. The 5 pinned Americans were still 20 yards ahead, barely moving, half frozen, waiting on a miracle they didn't dare expect. Currey didn't hesitate. He slid behind the burned-out Jeep, tugged open a half-torn pouch, and found 3 grenades inside, cold metal, heavy in his palm. He hooked them onto his belt and checked the pins by touch, fingers numb, but steady. A German squad crept along the left flank, their boots leaving deep tracks in the snow. 3 rifles, 1 MP40, 1 MG team shifting behind them. They thought the Americans had a full platoon hidden in the factory. They thought Currey was the forward element of something larger. He wasn't about to correct them. He moved low, crossing to a stack of timber where the snow was piled thick. The bar hugged tight against his ribs. His breath puffed in short bursts. He could feel the cold slicing through his coat with every step. He peeked around the timber. The Germans were close. Too close, working their way toward the 5 trapped GIs. If they reached them, it was over. Currey pulled a grenade, thumbed the pin loose, and whispered to himself, "Easy, easy." He lobbed it across the drift. The grenade arced through the frozen air and vanished behind a mound of broken masonry. A sharp blast kicked snow and smoke into the sky, stunning the German advance. Men dove for cover. One stumbled, fell face first into the slush. Another skidded behind a tree, shouting for the MG team to shift. Currey didn't wait for the dust to settle. He sprinted. His boots hammered the ice. The BR bounced against his shoulder. Grenades rattled against his hip. It was chaos. German fire snapping past him. Splinters flicking off the timber. Snow erupting where bullets punched through the ground. He slid behind a low concrete block and fired a burst from the bar. Controlled, precise. The lead rifleman dropped. The others scattered, shouts rising into the freezing air. Currey pulled his second grenade, yanked the pin, and sent it skidding behind the MG team. They never saw it. The explosion lifted snow like a white curtain, knocking the gunners flat. Currey shifted position again, breathing hard now, not from panic, but from momentum. He'd created a gap, a narrow window. It wouldn't last. Through the drifting smoke, he could see the 5 pinned Americans lift their heads, eyes wide, disbelief etched across their frostbitten faces. Currey checked the field again. The Germans were recovering. More silhouettes moved through the trees. More rifles leveled in his direction. He had seconds, maybe less, to push farther, to clear the path, to reach those men. He grabbed his last grenade, feeling the cold metal bite into his palm. Then he saw something shift in the fog. A fresh German fire team, moving exactly where he needed to go. They hadn't seen him yet, but they would, and his time was running out. At 0832, Currey gripped his last grenade, the pin trembling slightly between numb fingers. The cold had settled deep into his hands, turning every motion stiff and slow. But the German fire team creeping through the smoke wasn't slowing down. They were moving in a staggered line, machine pistol up front, rifles behind, closing the exact gap Currey needed to reach the pinned Americans. He shifted his weight, listened to the wind rattling loose sheet metal, tracked their silhouettes through waves of drifting snow. Then he rose, just high enough to throw. The grenade sailed low, skimming the icy ground before disappearing into the haze. Currey braced. The blast kicked up a white wall of snow and smoke, rolling through the courtyard with a deep, hollow thump. 2 Germans dropped instantly. Another staggered sideways, clutching his ear, his helmet clattering down the slope. Currey didn't wait. He charged forward with the bar tucked to his shoulder, boots slamming over shattered bricks and frozen slush. Rounds snapped past him, sharp, angry little sparks carving through the air. His coat tore on a jagged beam as he slid behind a rusted generator. A rifle round punched into the metal beside his head, ringing like a church bell. Currey felt the vibration through the steel, felt his breath tighten, felt the world shrinking to a narrow tunnel of movement and timing. Another burst of bar fire roared from his hands, tight, controlled, unforgiving. The remaining Germans dove for cover, tripping over each other in the scramble. Currey advanced again. He ducked behind a stack of shattered crates, frost and splinters sticking to his coat. From here he could see the 5 pinned Americans, pale faces, cracked lips, helmets dusted white with snow. They hadn't moved in nearly an hour. They were freezing, bleeding, half-conscious. Currey swallowed hard. He didn't have time to think about what happened if he failed. He fired another burst, sweeping the field in short arcs. 2 Germans went down. A third dove behind the wheel of a burned-out truck. But more shadows moved in the tree line. A fresh squad, maybe 2, pushing forward, trying to retake momentum. Currey's pulse hammered, cold and steady. He pushed out from cover, a quick slide, a sharp pivot, the bar barking in deadly rhythm. Spent casings rained onto the frozen ground, bouncing off ice like tiny brass sparks. A German NCO shouted something he didn't understand, pointing toward Currey's flank. Currey didn't need to understand the words, he understood the tone. They were regrouping, reforming, preparing to rush him. The bar clicked empty. Currey ducked behind a low concrete slab, breath frosting across his collar. He fumbled for a new magazine, fingers stiff, gloves wet and freezing. Somewhere, in the fog, a German shouted an order. Boots pounded against the snow. Currey slammed a new mag into the BR, barely, and rose as silhouettes charged through the shattered courtyard. He fired again, short harsh bursts, forcing them to scatter. But they weren't stopping. A hail of rifle rounds tore through the air above him, slicing snow from the beams overhead. Currey knew exactly what was happening. They were trying to overwhelm him by numbers, close the distance, get inside his line, crush the lone American blocking their advance. He checked his path to the pinned 5. Still 20 yards. Still open ground. Still death waiting in every direction. But Currey wasn't backing up. He lifted the bar one more time. Then he saw something shift near the tree line. A darker shape. Heavy. Deliberate. Another German squad stepping out of the woods. And if they made it to the courtyard, everything he'd fought for would collapse. At 0840, Currey pressed his back against the concrete slab, bar still hot in his hands, steam rising from the barrel like breath from a warhorse. The Germans had pulled back just enough to regroup, crouching behind wrecks and broken walls. But more silhouettes were pushing in from the tree line. Fresh rifles, fresh boots, fresh danger. Currey knew what that meant. His window was closing. He checked the distance to the 5 pinned Americans, 20 yards of open snow, swept every few seconds by stray MG bursts. Longer than it looked, shorter than it felt. The the kind of ground men crawled over once and never stood up from. He whispered to himself, barely audible, "Hold on, I'm coming." He rose into a crouch and moved, short, fast steps, eyes scanning every flicker of movement, breath cutting in sharp plumes through the frozen air. A burst of German fire ripped across the courtyard. Currey dropped to a knee, fired back, and scrambled behind a mound of shattered bricks. A bullet grazed his sleeve, cutting a neat line through the fabric. He didn't look at it, didn't have time. He peeked over the bricks. One German squad had taken position near a broken wagon, rifles trained on the pinned Americans. Another shifted behind the burned truck, trying to flank Currey's right. He tightened his grip on the BR. This wasn't just about reaching those 5 men. He had to clear a path wide enough to get them out alive. Currey leaned out and fired a controlled burst that snapped 2 Germans into the snow. Another ducked and rolled behind a wheel, shouting frantic commands. Currey shifted left, firing again, each burst measured, precise, pushing the squad backward inch by inch. But that wasn't enough. He had to get closer. Currey sprinted, a short, explosive dash, sliding behind another stack of crates. Splinters stung his face as a bullet shattered the top plank. He wiped the blood with his sleeve, checked the courtyard again, and moved. 10 yards. He could hear the pinned soldiers now, faint voices, ragged breaths, men talking low because talking louder would draw fire. "Is that Currey?" "No way. No way he made it this close." Currey didn't answer, didn't look back, didn't break rhythm. He rose from behind the crates and fired a long, suppressive burst to keep German heads down. Snow erupted around the enemy line, helmets dipped, rifles jerked low. This was the moment. Currey charged, boots slipping on frost, heart hammering, breath burning his throat. He skidded into a shallow depression in the snow, the closest thing to cover, just 5 feet from the pinned Americans. He slid over the ice until he was level with them, BR still ready, scanning the field. 5 pairs of eyes stared at him, wide, disbelieving, frozen with both terror and hope. One whispered, voice cracking, "Kid, you actually came." Currey nodded once. Then everything around them shifted, shadows moving, rifles raising, Germans preparing to retake the ground Currey had just carved open. He had reached the men. Now he had to get them out. And from the far tree line, the rumble of new armor started to roll in. At 08:55, Currey pressed a hand onto the nearest soldier's shoulder, feeling the tremble under the frozen uniform. 5 men half-conscious, frostbitten, bleeding lay fused to the snow like they'd grown roots in it. Their eyes flicked between Currey and the Germans regrouping across the courtyard. A low mechanical growl vibrated through the ground. Another tank. Currey didn't look at it yet. Not until he had to. He scanned the 5 men quickly. One had a shredded sleeve soaked dark with blood. Another's helmet was cracked clean through. All of them were shaking cold, shock. Fear, hard to tell which was winning. Currey slid into the hollow beside them, BR angled over his knee. "Listen up," he said quietly, voice freezing in the air. "We move on my word. Stay low. Crawl if you have to." One of the men croaked, "We're not going to make it out of here." Currey didn't argue. He just said, "Yeah, you are." A rifle round snapped inches above his head, kicking snow into his collar. Another burst tore through a crate behind them. The Germans had spotted the cluster of bodies and the lone kid defending them. Currey pivoted and fired a burst from the BR, cutting down a pair of riflemen trying to close the distance. Casings bounced off the ice like brass insects skittering across glass. He turned back to the 5. "Move!" They crawled, sluggish and stumbling, dragging themselves inch by inch toward the factory ruins. Currey moved with them, staying just ahead, shielding them with bursts of precise, furious fire. The courtyard erupted. German rifles cracked from every angle. Tracers sliced green streaks across the gray dawn. The air filled with splintered wood, shattered brick, and the sharp metallic whine of ricochets. Currey pivoted left, fired. Pivoted right, fired again. Short, controlled bursts. Never panicked. Never sloppy. A German squad tried to rush them from the wagon line. Currey caught them with a spray that scattered them into the snow like broken shadows. The 5 Americans crawled through the churned slush, grunting, slipping, dragging each other forward. 15 yards. Currey slid into a shallow ditch and laid down heavy cover fire, BR hammering in rhythmic kicks that rattled his bones. 10 yards. A German MG team set up near the tank husk, their barrels swinging toward Currey's position. Currey surged to his feet, sprinted across the ditch, and slid behind a half-collapsed wall just as the MG opened up, shredding the ground he'd occupied seconds earlier. He fired blindly around the rubble 3 short bursts. The MG stuttered, then fell silent. 7 yards. The pinned Americans were gasping, collapsing forward in tiny, painful lunges. Currey reloaded, hands shaking from cold and overuse, jammed the mag home with a sharp slap, and popped up again. German silhouettes pushed through the smoke, rifles raised. Currey fired until the smoke hid them again. 5 yards. The factory wall loomed close, now blackened brick, jagged openings. Salvation. Currey grabbed the nearest soldier by his collar and dragged him the last few feet. Another GI crawled with him, collapsing against the wall. But the Germans weren't finished. Boots thundered over ice. A fresh squad appeared through the drifting snow, weapons lifting, ready to cut down the retreating Americans in a single volley. Currey saw them. He shifted the bar, set his footing, steadied his breath. The next 10 seconds would decide everything. At 09:05, Currey planted himself in the snow between the 5 wounded Americans and the incoming German squad. He didn't shout, didn't curse, didn't even blink. He just raised the BR. The Germans opened fire first. Snow around Currey erupted in violent white sparks. Rounds punched into the wall behind him, showering him with brick dust. A tracer skimmed across his sleeve, burning a thin black line in the fabric. Currey stepped forward. 1 step, then another. Not running, not diving, just walking toward them with the calm of a man who had already made up his mind. He fired. The bar thundered in steady, brutal bursts, each one controlled, each one placed exactly where it needed to go. The leading German dropped instantly. The second stumbled, spun, collapsed into a drift. The third dove behind a wooden pallet that exploded under Currey's next burst. But more figures emerged through the haze. Another squad, then another. The courtyard swarmed with movement rifles lifting, helmets bobbing, boots crashing through ice. The Germans thought they were closing in on a full American force, because no one believed one kid could be producing that much fire. Currey shifted left, firing short bursts that drove a cluster of soldiers behind a burned-out truck. Shifted right, sending another squad scrambling behind a stack of crates. The recoil hammered his shoulder. The barrel glowed faintly through the frost. His gloves were soaked with melted snow and sweat. Still, he kept firing. Behind him, the 5 rescued GIs crawled deeper into the factory ruins, medics pulling them out of the line of fire. One of the wounded men turned, staring at Currey with a face full of disbelief. "He's buying us the whole damn sector," he rasped. Currey didn't hear him. He was busy forcing an entire German assault line to hit the brakes. A lieutenant among the Germans shouted orders, waving his men into a flanking spread. Currey caught the movement just a flicker and pivoted, dropping the lieutenant with a snapshot that cut the squad's coordination in half. The Germans hesitated. It was small, barely a breath. But in battle, a single hesitation is a crack in the wall. Currey hit it hard. He surged forward 3 steps, firing from the hip wild to anyone else, but each burst landing exactly where he intended. German helmets ducked. Boots scrambled backward. A squad that had been advancing suddenly broke left, stumbling over each other in the snow. The assault wavered. Then it buckled. From the distant ridge, a U.S. burst horn blared, short, sharp, familiar. Reinforcements. A platoon of American infantry pushed into the courtyard from the east, rifles raised, voices echoing through the ruins. The Germans faltered at the sight of fresh uniforms in the snow haze. Currey's relentless fire had already convinced them they were fighting at least a company. Now with new silhouettes emerging, they couldn't tell where the lines began or ended. The German advance collapsed. Boots turned. Orders shifted to retreat. Silhouettes melted back into the trees with hurried, panicked movements. Currey lowered the bar. Steam drifted from the barrel, rising like smoke from a hard day's work. Snowflakes settled on his helmet, unmelted. His breath came slow, steady, controlled. Behind him, the rescued Americans stared in stunned silence. Inside the factory, soldiers whispered to each other, not entirely sure they were seeing what they thought they saw. But Currey didn't turn, didn't celebrate, didn't even breathe any faster. He just scanned the tree line one more time, because something in the wind still felt unfinished. By 09:30, the courtyard finally went quiet. Not peaceful quiet, just the kind that settles after a storm tears everything apart. Currey lowered the bar and let the sling settle against his shoulder. The weapon felt heavier now, like it had soaked up every second of fear, fire, and frozen breath from the last 2 hours. Steam curled lazily from the barrel. Snowflakes drifted onto the metal and melted instantly. The wind carried the smell of burned fuel, scorched rubber, and cordite. sharp, metallic, unforgettable. The disabled tank still hissed in the cold, patches of smoke rising from the vents like ghosts slipping into the gray sky. To Curry's right, medics dragged the 5 rescued Americans deeper into the factory ruins, wrapping them in blankets, checking pulses, cutting away frozen sleeves. One of the wounded men kept staring at Curry, eyes wide and unfocused, whispering, "He came for us! He came for us!" over and over, like he needed the words to stay real. American reinforcements spread out across the courtyard, checking corners, overturning crates, pointing at the wrecked armor and the scatter of German gear. More than a few paused, looking between the battlefield and Curry as if the math didn't add up. "Who the hell was holding this sector?" one sergeant muttered. Another replied, "Couple dozen guys at least." A third shook his head. "Doesn't match the footprints. Looks like one?" They didn't quite believe it. Maybe didn't want to. Curry didn't explain. He was kneeling in the snow now, one hand braced on the ground, catching his breath. Not shaking, just letting the adrenaline drain out of him in slow, steady waves. His face stayed calm, eyes scanning the tree line out of habit. His old Garand hung from his shoulder, scratched stock dusted with frost. The same rifle people joked about. The same rifle that had opened the first path. He reached up and wiped a smudge of soot from the wood, almost gentle. A medic approached him, tapping his shoulder lightly. "You're hit?" he asked. Curry blinked. "No," he said softly, but his voice was tired, the kind of tired that settles deep in a man's bones. The medic looked him over anyway. Torn sleeve, scraped shoulder, soot-smeared face, bruised cheekbone, but no blood. Curry stood slowly, boots crunching in the hardened snow. He looked across the battlefield he'd just held alone craters, burned sledges, collapsed crates, enemy gear scattered like dead leaves. It didn't feel heroic, didn't feel glorious. It felt heavy, a weight he hadn't fully processed yet, a weight he didn't talk about then and rarely talked about later. The wind shifted. Somewhere deeper in the forest, a faint echo, maybe a distant engine, maybe just the cold snapping a tree rolled across the hills. Curry's eyes narrowed, watching the tree line, because something about the morning didn't feel finished yet. Curry stepped forward through the churned courtyard, each boot sinking into the mix of snow, mud, and scattered brass. The wind carried thin veils of powder across the ground, brushing over spent cartridges that glittered in the pale winter light. Smoke drifted from the disabled tank behind him, rising in slow ribbons that twisted into the gray sky. The whole battlefield felt frozen in place like the world was holding its breath, unsure what to make of what one 19-year-old had done. Ahead, 5 rescued Americans limped through the wreckage, arms slung around medics, boots dragging, faces half covered in frost and blood. Curry walked behind them, steady and quiet, guiding them back toward the broken entrance of the factory. They kept glancing back at him, half in disbelief, half in gratitude. They didn't know how to say. Reinforcements were spreading out now, checking the ground, staring at the destroyed positions, whispering to each other. A sergeant, with a lined face and a voice carved from gravel, stepped toward Curry, stopping a few feet away. He looked from the smoking tank, to the bodies in the snow, to the shattered German line, then back to the kid with the old Garand slung across his shoulder. "Kid," he muttered, "you held them off alone?" Curry shrugged, eyes calm, breath still steady. "Just did what I had to." The sergeant shook his head slowly, almost in disbelief, almost in respect. He looked like a man seeing something he knew would be retold for years in bunkers, bars, and barracks, whether Curry wanted that or not. Snow drifted down thicker now, catching the rising smoke, spinning it into soft gray spirals. The battlefield faded into a mix of white and shadow and quiet steam. Curry stood at the center of it, the Bayar hanging at his side, the battered M1 Garand resting against his shoulder, the same rifle everybody mocked, the same rifle he refused to replace because it shoots straight. He looked out across the field one last time, taking in the churned snow, the silence, the saved lives, the broken assault line. This wasn't triumph. This wasn't glory. This was the kind of moment war leaves behind, cold, lonely, unforgettable. Curry exhaled, a long white breath drifting into the winter air. And as the rescued men disappeared into the factory's dark doorway, he stepped forward too, fading into the gray Ardennes morning like a ghost who'd done his work and didn't need applause. The kid who wasn't supposed to lead. The kid with the barnstock rifle. The kid who stopped 40 Germans alone. And somewhere behind him, the snow kept falling soft, steady, silent covering everything he just survived.